The July wind crept through the cold stone corridors of Bradgate House. Inside, a 16-year-old girl, Lady Jane Grey, found her only warmth in the pages of old books, utterly unaware that her peaceful world was about to be crushed. The thunder of hooves outside brought not an invitation but a disguised death sentence. The ambitions of others placed a crown upon her head only to make her a sacrificial lamb, dragging her toward a horrific morning where she would witness her husband's headless body carried past her window. And then, moments later, it would be her turn to fumble blindly in the darkness, desperately searching for the chopping block with the cry, "What shall I do? Where is it?" This was the beginning of the brutal tragedy of the 9-Day Queen, a soul thrown into a living hell, condemned merely for the royal blood in her veins. Our story begins in a kingdom fractured by faith. For decades, England had been reeling from the seismic shock of King Henry VIII's break with the Roman Catholic Church. His desperate, obsessive quest for a male heir had not only led him through 6 wives, but had also torn the spiritual fabric of the nation apart. He had declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, dissolving the monasteries, seizing their wealth, and setting his country on a new and uncertain religious path. When Henry finally died in 1547, he left behind a tangled and dangerous legacy, embodied by his 3 children, each from a different mother and each representing a different future for England. First was Mary, his eldest daughter by his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Raised a devout Catholic, she had been declared a bastard by her own father, humiliated and cast aside. For her, the Protestant Reformation was not progress, it was a heresy, a stain on her mother's honor and a poison in the soul of her kingdom. She waited patiently, biding her time, her faith a cold, hard stone in her heart. Then there was Elizabeth, daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn. Like her half-sister, she too had been branded illegitimate. Cunning, cautious, and brilliantly intelligent, she was a Protestant, but of a more pragmatic sort. She had learned from a young age that survival in the Tudor court depended on revealing as little as possible, on watching, waiting, and keeping her own counsel. And finally, there was Edward, the son Henry had craved for so long. Edward VI ascended the throne as a mere boy of 9, but he was no one's puppet in matters of faith. Raised by Protestant tutors, he was fiercely, uncompromisingly pious. For Edward, the Reformation begun by his father was not enough. He saw it as his sacred duty to cleanse England of every last vestige of Catholic popery. His reign, guided by a council of powerful Protestant noblemen, saw churches stripped of their statues, stained glass smashed, and the Latin Mass replaced by a New English Book of Common Prayer. It was a cultural revolution, pushed through with the zeal of a true believer. At the head of Edward's government was the most powerful man in England, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. Dudley was a master political operator, ambitious, clever, and utterly ruthless. He had risen to the top by outmaneuvering his rivals and had become the young king's most trusted advisor. As a staunch Protestant, his fortunes were inextricably linked to Edward's religious project. He knew with chilling certainty that if the Catholic Mary ever came to the throne, his power, his wealth, and very likely his head would be forfeit. By the early spring of 1553, this precarious balance of power began to crumble. The young king, always a frail and delicate child, fell gravely ill. What started as a cough and a cold descended into something far more sinister, likely tuberculosis. As the king's life ebbed away, a panic gripped the heart of Northumberland's government. The Act of Succession passed by Henry VIII clearly stated that if Edward died without heirs, the crown would pass to Mary and then to Elizabeth. for Northumberland and his Protestant allies. The prospect of Bloody Mary, as they would later call her, taking the throne was nothing short of apocalyptic. It meant the end of the Reformation, the restoration of the Pope's authority, and the ruin of all they had built. It was in this crucible of fear and ambition that a desperate plan was forged, a plan to subvert the will of a dead king, to bypass the natural line of succession, and to place a new Protestant monarch on the throne. To do this, they needed a candidate with royal blood, impeccable Protestant credentials, and, most importantly, someone they could control. They needed Lady Jane Grey. Far from the seething cauldron of the London court, she grew up in the pastoral splendor of Bradgate Park in Leicestershire. Her blood, however, tied her irrevocably to that dangerous world. She was the great niece of King Henry VIII. Her mother, Frances Brandon, was the daughter of Henry's beloved younger sister, Mary Tudor, who had once been Queen of France before scandalously marrying an English nobleman, Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. This lineage placed Jane, her two younger sisters, and their mother firmly in the royal line of succession as stipulated by Henry VIII's will, a fact that would prove to be less a privilege and more a fatal curse. If Jane was born to a life of aristocratic expectation, she showed little natural aptitude for it. Her parents, Henry Grey, now Duke of Suffolk, and the formidable Frances Brandon, were figures of the second rank at court, possessed of a first-rate appetite for power and advancement. Their ambition far outstripped their political skill, and they seemed to view their eldest daughter less as a child to be nurtured, and more as an asset to be cultivated and exploited. By all surviving accounts, their household was not a place of warmth. Jane herself would later confide in her tutor, the Cambridge scholar Roger Ascham, that her parents' idea of discipline was relentless and cruel. For the slightest perceived failing, a misplaced curtsy, a misspoken word, a moment of girlish frivolity, she was subjected to a litany of casual punishments. "For when I am in presence either of father or mother," she told Ascham, "whether I speak, keep silence, sit, stand, or go, eat, drink, be merry or sad, be sewing, playing, dancing, or doing anything else, I must do it as it were, in such weight, measure, and number, even so perfectly as God made the world. Or else I am so sharply taunted, so cruelly threatened, yea, presently sometimes with pinches, nips, and bobs, and other ways so without measure misordered, that I think myself in hell." In the cold, loveless environment of her home, Jane found her sanctuary. Her escape was not into games or friendships, but into the vast, quiet, and ordered world of books. She was a child of the Renaissance, and her mind was a fertile ground for the seeds of humanist learning that were transforming European intellectual life. Humanism celebrated the rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman texts, promoting a curriculum based on languages, philosophy, and rhetoric. For a young noblewoman, this education was not intended to prepare her for a public role, but to instill piety, virtue, and moral fortitude. In Jane, these lessons found their most prodigious student. She was not merely bright, she was a genius. By her early teens, she had mastered Latin and Greek to a degree that astounded seasoned scholars. She was fluent in French and Italian and could read Hebrew. She devoured the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Plutarch in their original languages. More importantly, she immersed herself in the scriptures and the writings of the great Protestant reformers on the continent. She began a correspondence with leading theologians like Heinrich Bullinger in Zurich, who saw in this brilliant, pious English girl a future Deborah, a female prophet who would help safeguard the Reformed faith in England. The most famous and revealing portrait of the young Jane comes from that visit by Roger Ascham. Arriving at Bradgate Park, he found the Duke and Duchess and their entire retinue were out hunting. Ascham, however, found Jane inside, in her chamber, reading. He was astonished to discover her choice of text, Plato's Phaedo, the great dialogue on the death of Socrates and the immortality of the soul, which she was reading with ease and delight in the original Greek. Ascham asked her why she was not outside enjoying the hunt with the rest of the family. Her answer laid bare her inner world, a world where ideas were more real and more thrilling than any physical pastime. I whiz, all their sport in the park is but a shadow to that pleasure that I find in Plato, she told him. Alas, good folk, they never felt what true pleasure meant. For Jane, true pleasure was not the thrill of the chase or the laughter of the court, but the profound intellectual and spiritual communion she found in her books. Her library was her fortress and her kingdom, the only one she would ever truly desire. This extraordinary combination of royal blood, fierce intellect, and unimpeachable Protestant piety made her a uniquely valuable pawn on the political chessboard. When she was just 10 years old, she was sent to join the household of the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final wife. Catherine, a kind, intelligent woman and a committed Protestant reformer, had gathered around her a circle of bright young wards and like-minded intellectuals. For a brief sunlit period, Jane was immersed in a loving, intellectually vibrant environment, the polar opposite of her own home. She studied alongside other noble children and even formed a close sisterly bond with the young Princess Elizabeth, who also resided there. It was likely the happiest and most stable time of her young life. But the Tudor court was never a safe harbor. After King Henry's death, Catherine Parr, in a move that shocked the court, hastily married the handsome, charming, and dangerously ambitious Thomas Seymour, Lord High Admiral of England, and uncle to the new boy King Edward VI. Thomas was consumed by a toxic jealousy of his older brother, Edward Seymour, who held the supreme power of Lord Protector. He schemed relentlessly to increase his own influence, plotting to gain custody of the young king and even engaging in scandalous, inappropriate behavior with the teenage Princess Elizabeth. His flirtations escalated from morning romps and tickling games to an incident where he held Elizabeth down while Catherine Parr helped him cut her black gown into 100 pieces. Jane was a silent, horrified witness to this predatory behavior, an early and terrifying lesson in how personal desire and political ambition could curdle into something corrupt and deadly. Thomas Seymour's reckless plotting eventually went too far. In 1549, he was arrested, charged with 33 counts of treason, and beheaded on Tower Hill. The scandal engulfed everyone in his circle, including Elizabeth, who was interrogated with terrifying severity. The sanctuary had been violated. Following Seymour's execution and Catherine Parr's death from childbirth shortly before, Jane was sent back to her parents at Bradgate Park. Her brief idyll was over. The cold realities of the world were closing in, and she retreated once more into the quiet comfort of her books, unaware that the men who governed England were already beginning to see her not as a scholar, but as a solution to a problem that would soon become a crisis of life and death. The conspiracy born in the shadowed sick room of a dying king and sealed with coerced signatures, and a loveless marriage was now complete. All the pieces were in place. All that remained was to inform the queen-to-be of her new and terrible destiny. As Jane made the short journey to Sion House, she was crossing an invisible threshold, leaving behind the last vestiges of her private life as a scholar and a girl. She was entering the reality of the gilded cage her marriage had created, unaware that the men waiting for her were not there to offer greetings, but to place a crown of sorrows upon her head and push her onto a stage she was never meant to occupy. Sion House was a place of ghosts. Once a thriving Brigittine monastery, its walls had once echoed with plainchant and prayer. Now seized by the crown and granted to the Dudleys, it stood as a monument to the new secular order, its grand halls stripped of their sacred character and repurposed as a stage for worldly power. It was here, within these stolen walls on the evening of July 9th, 1553, that Lady Jane Grey waited. She had been brought here from Chelsea with little explanation, told only that she was to receive an important communication from the King's Council. She was nervous, but her anxiety was that of a young woman caught in events she did not understand, not of a conspirator awaiting the culmination of a plot. She likely assumed it was some new directive concerning her household, or perhaps a summons to the king's bedside. The thought that King Edward might be dead, let alone that she was to be his successor, was utterly beyond the scope of her imagination. The great hall of Sion was filled with a tense, expectant silence. With Jane were her parents, the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk, her new husband Guilford Dudley, and his parents, the formidable Duke and Duchess of Northumberland. The air was thick with unspoken knowledge. For everyone in that room, save Jane herself, this was the moment they had been scheming and waiting for. They watched her, this quiet, unassuming girl in her fine dress, and saw not a daughter or a daughter-in-law, but a key that would unlock the treasury of England. Finally, the doors swung open. A delegation of the highest-ranking men in the kingdom filed into the room. The Marquess of Northampton, the Earls of Arundel, Huntingdon, and Pembroke, and at their head the architect of the entire affair, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Their faces were grim and set with a feigned solemnity that barely masked the frantic ambition beneath. They walked in procession towards Jane, and then as one, they dropped to their knees before her. The gesture was so shocking, so contrary to all protocol, that Jane was momentarily stunned into silence. These were the great men of the realm, men who bowed only to royalty. Before she could process its meaning, Northumberland began to speak. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, was now laden with a carefully rehearsed gravitas. He informed her that her beloved cousin, the pious King Edward VI, had succumbed to his illness and was now with God. The news of Edward's death alone would have been a terrible blow. Jane had been fond of the young king, a fellow scholar, and a companion in the Protestant faith. But before she could even absorb the grief of it, Northumberland continued, his words falling like hammer blows on the anvil of her reality. The late king, he explained, had been deeply concerned for the future of the realm and the preservation of the true religion. Therefore, with the full consent and authority of his privy council, he had set aside his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, and had, by his final will and letters patent, named her, Lady Jane, as his rightful heir and successor to the imperial crown of England. At the conclusion of his speech, he and the other lords paid her homage, bowing their heads and acknowledging her as their sovereign queen. The effect on the 16-year-old girl was not one of triumph, but of pure, unadulterated terror. The world tilted on its axis. This was not an honor. It was a blasphemy. It was not a destiny. It was a damnation. According to her own account, written later from her prison cell in the Tower, she fell to the ground weeping piteously. The shock was so profound it manifested as a physical collapse. When she was finally helped to her feet, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and righteous indignation, her first words were not of acceptance, but of horrified refusal. "The crown is not my right, and pleaseth me not," she protested, her words tumbling out in a desperate torrent. "The Lady Mary is the rightful heir." She argued with a clarity and force that must have stunned the men who had so badly misjudged her as a docile pawn. She cited the act of succession. She cited her own insufficiency for such a high office. She cited the laws of God and of man, which this plan so flagrantly violated. She saw the plot for exactly what it was, not the pious will of a dying king, but a treasonous power grab by her father-in-law. She pleaded with them, turning from one stony face to the next, searching for a flicker of reason or conscience. She saw none. Her father-in-law, John Dudley, brushed her legal and moral arguments aside with contemptuous ease. This was not a debate, it was a coronation. He and the other counselors insisted it had been Edward's dying wish, that it was her sacred duty to uphold the Protestant faith and save the kingdom from popery. Her own father, the weak and ambitious Duke of Suffolk, urged her to accept, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of becoming the father of a queen. Her husband Guilford stood by silently, his handsome face a mask of entitlement. She was utterly alone, a single voice of sanity, in a room full of powerful, determined men intoxicated by their own audacity. They pressed in on her, their arguments relentless, their flattery cloying. They knelt before her again, calling her Your Majesty, their performance of loyalty a suffocating trap. Overwhelmed, exhausted, and surrounded by the unyielding pressure of her family and the entire political establishment, her spirit finally broke. There was no more strength left to fight. Defeated, she ended her protestations and, according to her own account, uttered a prayer, her voice barely a whisper. She asked God that if this act was truly rightful in His eyes, He would grant her the grace and strength to govern for His glory and the good of the kingdom. It was the prayer of a condemned soul, not a triumphant monarch. The men in the room took it as her assent. The scholar from Bradgate Park had been silenced. In her place stood Queen Jane. The following day, July 10th, was a spectacle designed to cement this new reality in the public mind. A grand procession was to convey the new queen from Sion House to the Tower of London. The Tower at this time was not merely the infamous prison of later repute. It was a royal fortress, a palace, and the traditional residence for a monarch in the days preceding their coronation. The journey was a calculated piece of political theater. Jane traveled by royal barge down the River Thames, the ancient highway of London power. She was dressed in green velvet, embroidered with gold, the Tudor colors, a deliberate visual claim to the dynasty she was supplanting. Her fiery red hair, a trait she shared with her Tudor cousins, was adorned with jewels. Her mother, the Duchess of Suffolk, carried her train, but the theater failed. The crowds that gathered on the river banks and on London Bridge to watch the spectacle were sparse, and more unnervingly they were silent. There were no joyous shouts of "God save the Queen." There were no tossed caps, no pealing bells from the city's many church towers. There was only a sullen, watchful quiet. The people of London were not fools. They were deeply conservative in their respect for law and lineage. They knew that Henry VIII's daughter, Mary, was the rightful heir. This sudden appearance of a new unknown queen, the daughter-in-law of the widely despised Duke of Northumberland, felt wrong. It smelled of a conspiracy, a backroom deal among the powerful. The silence of the London crowd was not neutral. It was a damning verdict, a passive resistance that spoke volumes. The procession, intended as a triumph, felt more like a ghost ship gliding through a dead city. Once she passed through the treacherous arch of Traitor's Gate and into the formidable stone embrace of the Tower, Jane's strange and surreal reign began. The royal apartments were opulent, hung with tapestries and furnished with treasures. She was presented with the crown jewels, the heavy, glittering symbols of a power she had never sought. Her mother-in-law, the ambitious Duchess of Northumberland, immediately began instructing her on the finer points of royal etiquette, a condescending stream of advice that Jane, who had been raised in aristocratic households her entire life, endured with quiet resentment. Proclamations were sent out across the realm, printed with her name and titles, but she held no actual power. She was a figurehead, a living symbol for Northumberland's regime. Yet even in this terrifying and powerless situation, flashes of the principled, stubborn girl who read Plato in Greek began to emerge. The first crisis of her reign was not a matter of state, but a domestic squabble that revealed the steel in her spine. Her husband, Guilford Dudley, egged on by his imperious mother, came to her and demanded that she make him king. It was not enough for him to be the queen's consort. He wanted the crown itself. He was her husband, he argued, and it was his right. Jane's response was immediate and unequivocal. She refused. She calmly informed him that the letters patent from King Edward had made her queen, and that the power to create a king was not hers to give. It could only be granted by an act of Parliament. The most she could do, she offered as a compromise, was to make him a duke. Guilford, who possessed all of his father's arrogance but none of his intellect, flew into a spoiled tantrum. He shouted, wept, and threatened not to sleep with her again. He ran to his mother, who then descended upon Jane in a fury, screaming that she would not have her son be a mere duke. The Duchess forbade Guilford from sharing Jane's bed, and commanded him to leave the tower and return to Sion House. It was an ugly, humiliating scene at the very heart of the new royal court. Yet in this, Jane was immovable. Trapped, isolated, and likely terrified for her life, she nonetheless clung to the letter of the law. She would not be bullied into an illegal act, not by her husband, and not by his fearsome mother. It was a small private act of defiance, but it was a profound one. It demonstrated to the Dudleys and perhaps to herself that the quiet scholar was no one's simple puppet. While Jane was fending off her rapacious in-laws and trying to grasp the duties of a role she never wanted, the woman she had been chosen to replace was proving to be a far more formidable adversary than Northumberland had ever imagined. Mary Tudor was not cowering in a corner. Having successfully escaped Northumberland's trap, she had ridden to Kenninghall in Norfolk and then to the mighty fortress of Framlingham Castle in Suffolk. There, she raised her standard, and in a bold and brilliant move, proclaimed herself the true and rightful Queen of England. She sent letters to the Privy Council in London and to the nobles across the realm, demanding their allegiance and denouncing the treason of Northumberland. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The English people, whatever their religious differences, revered the Tudor dynasty and the sanctity of the line of succession. They saw Mary as Henry VIII's true-born heir and Jane as the puppet of an overmighty subject. Nobles, gentry, and common men began to flock to her banner. The Earl of Bath and Lord Windsor deserted the council in London and rode to join her. The crews of 6 royal warships sent by Northumberland to blockade the coast mutinied and declared their loyalty to Mary. Her makeshift force swelled by the day, transforming from a desperate band of loyalists into a legitimate and powerful army. The country was rallying not to the Queen in the Tower, but to the Queen in the castle. Northumberland was stunned by the speed and scale of the popular uprising. He had catastrophically misjudged the mood of the nation, believing he could impose his will through force and intimidation. Now he was forced to act. He had no choice but to march out of London himself at the head of an army to confront Mary and crush her rebellion. On July 14th, he rode out of the city, a magnificent figure in gleaming armor leading a well-equipped force. But as he led his troops through the silent streets of Shoreditch, he turned to a fellow nobleman and remarked with a chilling prescience, "The people press to see us, but not one of them saith, God speed ye." He knew the tide was turning against him. His departure from London would prove to be a fatal error. It removed the shield of fear that had held the capital and the Privy Council in check. The moment his menacing presence was gone, the wavering councillors who had signed the devise under duress began to plot. They saw their chance to escape the trap he'd set for them and for the kingdom. Inside the Tower of London, Queen Jane continued her strange phantom reign. She presided over council meetings, signed documents placed before her, and tried to conduct herself with the dignity she believed the office required. But her 9-day reign was a house of cards, built on a foundation of treason and lies, and a great wind was rising from the east that was about to blow it all away. Jane's phantom reign within the tower was a hollow piece of theater, performed to an empty and hostile house. While she wrestled with the petty ambitions of her new husband and the crushing weight of a role she detested, the real drama was unfolding beyond the fortress walls. The departure of the Duke of Northumberland, the one man whose menacing presence held the conspiracy together, had created a power vacuum in the capital. It was a fatal miscalculation, for a government built on fear cannot survive the absence of the feared. The house of cards so carefully constructed by Dudley was about to be blown away, not by the force of Mary's approaching army, but by the shifting winds of betrayal from within his own council. As John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, rode north from London, the heavy summer air seemed to press down on him, thick with foreboding. He was the most powerful man in England, a seasoned general leading a professional army against what he perceived as a provincial rabble led by a woman. On paper, his victory should have been swift and certain. But Dudley, for all his cunning, had made a fatal miscalculation. He had understood the mechanics of power, the control of the council, the treasury, and the armories, but he had failed to grasp its soul. He had not accounted for the deep, almost mystical reverence the English people held for the Tudor bloodline and the legitimate order of succession. He was not marching against a rival faction. He was marching against the will of the nation itself. His army's progress was slow, hampered by torrential summer rains that turned the roads into a quagmire. More debilitating than the mud, however, was a creeping rot in the morale of his men. The soldiers, conscripted from the local populace, had no love for the Duke and no loyalty to his cause. They began to desert in droves, melting away into the countryside under the cover of night. Dudley arrived in Cambridge on July 16th to find his forces dwindling, and the news from every quarter growing worse. The nobility of England was not rallying to Queen Jane. They were declaring for Queen Mary. He was isolated, his authority evaporating with every passing hour. He found himself in the bizarre position of having to proclaim Jane as queen in the marketplace of a town that was already on the verge of declaring for her rival. He was a general with a shrinking army, a kingmaker whose creation was being rejected by the entire kingdom. While Dudley's campaign floundered in the rain-sodden fields of East Anglia, the political ground in London shifted beneath his feet with the force of an earthquake. His departure had removed the one thing holding his fragile coalition together: fear. The members of the Privy Council, many of whom he had threatened and bullied into supporting his coup, now saw their chance not only to save their own skins, but to align themselves with the winning side. The architects of this counter-coup were two of the most cunning survivors in the Tudor court: Henry Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, and William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke. Both men were religious conservatives who had outwardly conformed to the Protestant regime but secretly despised Dudley and his radical reforms. On the morning of July 19th, they made their move. Citing the need to confer with the French ambassador, they obtained permission to leave the Tower of London, where they had been effectively held under guard. Once outside the tower's walls, they rode directly to Baynard's castle, the Earl of Pembroke's grand riverside residence. There, they summoned the Lord Mayor of London, the city aldermen, and the other wavering members of the council. Inside the great hall of the castle, the Earl of Arundel delivered a speech that was a masterpiece of political rhetoric and personal venom. He denounced Northumberland as a traitorous tyrant who had sought to bereave us of our lawful queen, not for the sake of religion, but for his own devilish ambition. He played on their fears, their guilt, and their instinct for self-preservation, urging them to right the terrible wrong they had committed. The Earl of Pembroke, a bluff and formidable soldier, slammed his hand on the table and swore he was ready to fight to the death for Queen Mary. The mood in the room, tense and fearful only moments before, ignited. One by one, the councillors scrambled to abandon the sinking ship of Queen Jane and pledge their fealty to Queen Mary. They wasted no time. A herald was summoned, and the procession rode to the cross in Cheapside, the traditional heart of the city. There, before a rapidly swelling crowd, the proclamation was read. Mary Tudor, daughter of King Henry VIII, was the true and rightful Queen of England. The reaction of the city was instantaneous and ecstatic. The sullen silence that had greeted Jane 9 days earlier erupted into a deafening roar of celebration. It was as if the entire city had been holding its breath and could finally exhale in a single joyous shout. The bells of St. Paul's and 100 other parish churches began to peal wildly. People poured out of their houses, strangers embracing in the streets. That night, bonfires were lit on every corner, the tables were brought out, and wine flowed freely as London celebrated its liberation from the grip of the Dudleys and the restoration of its rightful monarch. The 9-day reign of Queen Jane was over, washed away in a tidal wave of popular acclaim for Queen Mary. The news spread through the city like wildfire, reaching the stone walls of the tower itself. Inside the royal apartments, Jane was at dinner. The commander of the fortress, the Marquis of Winchester, had already slipped away to join his fellow councillors at Baynard's castle, taking the crown jewels with him as a peace offering to the new queen. The man who brought Jane the final devastating news was the one who should have been her fiercest protector, her own father. The Duke of Suffolk, a man defined by his weakness and vacillating ambition, entered his daughter's chambers. The game was up, and his only thought was to save himself. In a moment of pathetic symbolic theater, he walked over to the cloth of state that hung above her head, the canopy that signified her royal status, and tore it down. His words were blunt, stripped of all ceremony. "You are no longer queen," he told her. He explained that the council had proclaimed Mary, and that was the end of it. For Jane, this news was not a tragedy. It was a profound, almost unimaginable relief. The crushing weight of a crown she had never wanted was suddenly lifted. All the fear, the confusion, the terrible responsibility that had been forced upon her vanished in an instant. Her reported reply is one of the most poignant and revealing utterances in English history. She looked at her father, her expression not of a fallen monarch, but of a lost child, and asked with simple innocence, "Can I go home now?" But she could not go home. Bradgate Park, with its sunlit gardens and quiet library, was a world away, a paradise lost forever. The Tower of London, which for 9 days had been her palace, now reverted to its more familiar function. It was her prison. The yeoman jailers who had served her were now her keepers. The brief, surreal chapter of her life as a queen was closed. A new, far darker chapter, as a condemned traitor, had begun. Her father, in a final act of self-preservation, went out into the fortress and proclaimed Mary as queen himself, a desperate attempt to prove his loyalty that would fool no one. He was arrested shortly thereafter. News of the coup in London reached a stunned Duke of Northumberland in Cambridge. His cause had disintegrated completely. Seeing no other option, he rode to the marketplace and, with tears of humiliation streaming down his face, threw his cap in the air and proclaimed his loyalty to the very queen he had set out to capture. The pathetic display did him no good. The next day, the Earl of Arundel arrived with a warrant and arrested him for high treason. When confronted, the great Duke fell to his knees and groveled for mercy from the man he had so recently threatened. Arundel looked down on him with cold contempt. Northumberland, his sons, and his key supporters were escorted back to London under heavy guard, pelted with stones and jeered by the furious populace, and imprisoned in the Tower. On August 3rd, Queen Mary made her triumphant entry into London. She was greeted by a city delirious with joy. At Aldgate, she was met by her half-sister Elizabeth and a procession of nobles. The two daughters of Henry VIII, so often rivals and prisoners of circumstance, rode side by side through the cheering crowds to the Tower. It was there that Mary performed her first act of clemency, releasing the high-profile Catholic prisoners who had been incarcerated during Edward's reign, including the aged Duke of Norfolk. But for the prisoners of her own making, the future was far less certain. Initially, Jane's imprisonment was not unduly harsh. She was moved from the opulent royal apartments to the more modest lodgings of the gentleman jailer. But these were still comfortable rooms. She was allowed to keep 2 of her ladies in waiting. She was permitted her books, and she could take walks in the Queen's garden within the Tower walls. Mary, now 37 years old, was in a difficult position. She knew her young cousin was not the architect of the plot. She had been a pawn, more sinned against than sinning. Mary's primary rage was directed at Northumberland, the man she rightly saw as the villain of the piece. On August 18th, Northumberland, along with several of his key associates, was brought to trial for high treason in Westminster Hall. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. He was sentenced to be beheaded. In a final desperate and utterly pathetic attempt to save his life, the great Protestant champion sent a message to the Queen, begging for mercy and announcing that he had seen the error of his ways and wished to convert to Catholicism. Mary allowed a Catholic bishop to see him, and on the scaffold on August 22nd, John Dudley publicly renounced the Protestant faith he had imposed on the nation. "I am a Catholic," he declared to the astonished crowd, warning them to turn away from the false religion. His conversion was a cynical last-ditch gamble, and it failed. It did him no good. The axe fell, and the man who had tried to steal a crown paid the ultimate price for his ambition. In November 1553, it was Jane's turn to face justice. She, her husband Guilford, and 2 of his brothers were escorted from the Tower to the Guildhall in the city of London for their own trial. Dressed in black, Jane conducted herself with a quiet dignity and composure that impressed all who saw her. She pleaded guilty to the charge of high treason, as she had in fact illegally usurped the royal title. The verdict was inevitable. She and the others were found guilty. The sentence, read out in the cold formal language of the law, was that she was to be burned alive on Tower Hill or beheaded as the Queen pleases. She heard her fate without flinching, made a deep curtsy to her judges, and was escorted back to her prison. She was now a condemned woman living on borrowed time, entirely at the mercy of the cousin, whose throne she had so briefly and unwillingly occupied. Yet Mary hesitated. To execute a 16-year-old girl, even one who had technically committed treason, felt wrong. It was clear to everyone that Jane had been cruelly manipulated by her elders. Mary suspended the death sentence indefinitely. For a few months, a fragile hope lingered in the cold stone rooms of the tower. It seemed possible, even likely, that Jane would eventually be pardoned and allowed to retire into the quiet, scholarly obscurity she had always craved. She was a pawn, and the king in the game was already dead. Perhaps she could still be swept from the board and allowed to live. But the Game of Thrones was not over, and a new, even more dangerous political storm was gathering. A storm that would ultimately ensure that the axe, once sharpened, would not be denied its victim. With the architects of the coup defeated and Jane's own legal guilt acknowledged, a fragile hope flickered within her prison walls. She was a condemned traitor, yet the Queen's mercy seemed a real and tangible possibility. But the fate of a single individual, even one of royal blood, is seldom decided in isolation. The stability of Mary's throne depended not just on punishing past treasons, but on preventing future ones. As the new queen turned her attention to securing her dynasty through a controversial foreign marriage, she would inadvertently ignite a new fire of rebellion across her kingdom, a fire whose desperate flames would reach the tower and consume the last hope of the girl who waited unknowingly for a final fatal turn of the political wheel. For a few fleeting months in the autumn and early winter of 1553, a fragile, uncertain quiet settled over Jane Grey's life. Within the cold stone confines of the tower, a semblance of her old scholarly routine returned. She had her books, the silent companions that had always been her truest friends. She had her ladies-in-waiting, and she was treated with a degree of courtesy befitting her rank. The sentence of death pronounced so formally in the Guildhall hung over her, but it was a distant thunder, suspended by the Queen's apparent reluctance to act. Queen Mary, now secure on her throne, showed little appetite for the blood of her young cousin. She was known to have acknowledged that Jane had been a victim of the rapacious ambitions of others, a pawn in a game she never wished to play. A pardon seemed not just possible, but probable. Jane might yet be allowed to exchange her prison for a quiet country retirement, to live out her days in the peaceful obscurity she had always craved. But the throne of England in the mid-16th century was not a seat of comfort. It was a precarious perch atop a powder keg of religious division and political intrigue. And Queen Mary, in her determination to secure her reign and her faith, was about to light the fuse. The issue that would shatter the fragile peace and seal Jane's fate was the single most important question of Mary's reign: her marriage. At 37, Mary was unmarried and childless. To secure the Tudor dynasty and, more importantly, to ensure the permanent restoration of Catholicism in England, she needed a Catholic heir. Her choice of husband fell upon the most eligible Catholic prince in Europe, her cousin, Philip, Prince of Spain. He was the son and heir of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in the world. For Mary, the match was a dream. It was a grand dynastic alliance that would unite England with the mighty Habsburg Empire, guaranteeing the future of the Catholic faith in her realm and elevating England's status on the world stage. For a great many of her subjects, however, it was a nightmare. The announcement of the Queen's intention to marry the Spanish prince was met with a wave of popular fury and aristocratic alarm. An intense xenophobia, a deep-seated suspicion of all things foreign, was an ingrained part of the English character. The Spanish in particular were viewed with a mixture of fear and contempt, seen as arrogant, cruel, and fanatically Catholic. There was a widespread terror that England would become a mere satellite of the vast Spanish Empire, its interests subordinated to those of the Habsburgs, its soldiers forced to fight Spanish wars on the continent. The Protestant faction, already reeling from the reversal of the Reformation, saw the marriage as the final nail in the coffin of their faith. Philip was a militant Catholic, and they feared he would bring with him the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition, with its torture chambers and public burnings of heretics. These simmering fears soon boiled over into open conspiracy. In the winter of 1553 to 1554, a group of disgruntled nobles and gentlemen, united by their opposition to the Spanish match, hatched a desperate plot. Led by Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger from Kent, Sir Peter Carew from Devon, and Sir James Croft from the Welsh borders, they planned a series of coordinated uprisings across the country. Their goal was to depose Mary and, most likely, place her 20-year-old half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, on the throne. Elizabeth would then be married to Edward Courtenay, a young English nobleman with a plausible, if distant, claim to the throne. It was a desperate gamble to keep England in English hands, and in a moment of catastrophic, almost suicidal misjudgment, one more name was added to the list of conspirators: Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, the father of Lady Jane. The very man whose ambition had already cost his daughter a crown now foolishly risked his neck and hers in a second rebellion. Believing he could raise the Midlands in his daughter's name, he joined the plot, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the Queen held Jane's life in the palm of her hand. The rebellion, planned for the spring of 1554, was a disorganized failure from the start. The plot was uncovered prematurely, forcing the conspirators to act before they were ready. In Devon and on the Welsh border, the uprisings fizzled out before they could even begin. Only Thomas Wyatt in Kent managed to raise a significant force. A charismatic and popular figure, he rallied several thousand men to his banner and began to march on London, denouncing the Spanish marriage and demanding the Queen change her counselors. The news of Wyatt's advance threw the capital into a state of panic. The loyalty of the Londoners, who had so recently cheered for Mary, was now in doubt. But in this moment of supreme crisis, Mary Tudor showed the formidable courage that was her birthright. Refusing her counselors' advice to flee, she rode to the Guildhall and delivered the speech of her life. With the sword of state carried before her, she addressed the assembled citizens of London, her voice ringing with defiance. She spoke to them not as a frightened woman, but as their queen, the daughter of the great king, Henry VIII. She declared her love for her people and swore that if Parliament deemed the marriage not to be for the good of the kingdom, she would not proceed, but she would not be dictated to by a rebel. "Good subjects," she cried, "pluck up your hearts, and like true men stand fast against these rebels, and fear them not, for I assure you I fear them nothing at all." Her speech was a triumph. The Londoners, stirred by her raw courage, rallied to her cause. They armed themselves, the city gates were barred, and when Wyatt and his weary, rain-soaked army reached the outskirts of the city, they found it an impregnable fortress. After a final desperate skirmish at Ludgate, the rebellion collapsed. Wyatt surrendered and was taken to the Tower. The rebellion was crushed, but its aftershocks would prove fatal for Jane. Her father, the Duke of Suffolk, had managed to raise only a pathetic handful of followers in the Midlands before he was forced to flee. He was discovered a few days later hiding in a hollow oak tree on his estate, and was also brought to the Tower. His foolish, treasonous actions had sealed his daughter's fate. Jane was no longer simply a pathetic pawn from a failed coup 6 months prior. Her father's actions had thrust her back into the political spotlight. She was now a living symbol of Protestant resistance, a figurehead around whom future and perhaps more successful rebellions could rally. As long as Lady Jane Grey lived, Mary's throne would never be secure. The pressure on the Queen to act was now immense. The Spanish ambassador Simon Renard, a shrewd and calculating adviser, pressed the point relentlessly in his private counsel with the Queen. Clemency, he argued, was a dangerous luxury she could no longer afford. The Spanish marriage could not proceed safely while there were alternative Protestant claimants to the throne who could serve as a focus for dissent. Every day that Jane lived was an encouragement to Mary's enemies. The security of the state, the future of the Catholic faith, and the stability of the Tudor line all demanded her death. With a heavy heart, caught between her personal desire for mercy and the brutal logic of political necessity, Queen Mary finally relented. She signed the death warrants for her young cousin Jane and for her husband, Lord Guilford Dudley. The date of the execution was set for February 9th, 1554. The brief flickering hope that had sustained Jane through the winter months was extinguished. The suspended sentence was now a terrible, imminent reality. The axe once sharpened was to be put to use. The failure of Wyatt's rebellion slammed the door on any possibility of clemency. With her earthly fate now sealed, the focus of her story shifts from the political to the spiritual, from the clamor of the court to the quiet of a prison cell. The final act of Jane Grey's life would not be a struggle for a throne or for survival, but for the integrity of her soul, as she prepared to face not her earthly queen, but her heavenly king. The signing of the death warrant was a legal finality, a stroke of the pen that transformed Lady Jane Grey from a prisoner into a ghost in waiting. The machinery of the state, once set in motion, was inexorable. The carpenters in the tower began their grim work, sawing and hammering together the wooden scaffold on which she would die. The executioner was summoned, his axe inspected and sharpened. For the Queen and her council, the matter was one of political necessity, a brutal but essential piece of statecraft. But for Mary Tudor, a woman of deep and troubled piety, there was one final, urgent matter to attend to. She could not save her cousin's life, but she felt a profound, almost desperate obligation to save her immortal soul. In Mary's worldview, to die outside the embrace of the Roman Catholic Church was to die in a state of mortal sin, condemned to eternal damnation. She could not bear the thought of this brilliant, pious, yet tragically misguided young woman facing God as a heretic. So, in a final act of what she considered to be supreme mercy, she dispatched her personal chaplain, John Feckenham, to the Tower. Feckenham, the newly appointed Dean of St. Paul's, was a man renowned for his learning, his eloquence, and his compassionate nature. His mission was twofold: to debate with Jane, to dismantle her Protestant beliefs through logic and scripture, and to persuade her to renounce her heresy and accept the Catholic faith. To give him time for this holy work, the Queen granted a 3-day stay of execution, postponing the sentence from February 9th to the 12th. It was a reprieve offered not for the sake of life, but for the sake of heaven. When John Feckenham entered Jane's chambers, he found not a frightened, hysterical girl, but a calm, composed scholar who greeted him with a grave and quiet courtesy. What followed over the next 3 days was not a simple catechism, but one of the most remarkable theological confrontations of the age. It was a duel of intellects, a battle of faiths, fought not with swords, but with Scripture, between the seasoned, compassionate churchman and the teenage prodigy. Feckenham began with gentle persuasion, expressing his sorrow for her predicament and his deep concern for her soul. Jane listened patiently before responding, with a clarity that immediately established the terms of their engagement. "I am ready to die," she told him, "and I am confident that I shall be received into the number of the elect." Their debate quickly moved to the central, irreconcilable differences that divided their two churches. They argued over the doctrine of justification, whether salvation was achieved through faith alone, as the Protestants believed, or through a combination of faith and good works, as the Catholics taught. Jane, steeped in the writings of Luther and the Reformers, held firm to her belief that her salvation was a free gift from God, secured by Christ's sacrifice, and not something she could ever earn. Faith only justifieth, she insisted, quoting the Apostle Paul. The core of their dispute, however, was the sacrament of the Eucharist. For Feckenham in the Catholic Church, the bread and wine of the Mass, when consecrated by a priest, became the literal physical body and blood of Jesus Christ through the miracle of transubstantiation. To deny this was the gravest of heresies. Jane, however, saw it as a form of idolatry, a misunderstanding of a spiritual truth. I ground my faith upon God's word and not upon the church, she told him calmly. When he pressed her, insisting that Christ himself had said, "This is my body," she countered with a theologian's precision. "I grant he saith so," she replied, "and so he saith, I am the vine, I am the door, but he is never the more the door or the vine." She argued that Christ's presence in the sacrament was real but spiritual, a memorial and a symbol, not a literal transformation of substance. That which he took of the Virgin is the flesh you speak of, she explained patiently, but that which is received in the supper is the bread. Feckenham, for all his learning, found himself outmatched. He was accustomed to debating with other churchmen, not with a teenage girl who could cite the church fathers in Greek and dissect Scripture with such formidable logic. He was so impressed by her intellect and so moved by her unwavering conviction that his mission of conversion began to feel like a hopeless assault on a fortress of faith. He reportedly left one of their sessions in tears, not of frustration, but of sorrow. He came to see her not as a heretic to be condemned, but as a soul of extraordinary purity who was tragically, in his view, mistaken. "I'm sorry for you," he is said to have told her at the end of their debates, "for I am sure we two shall never meet," meaning they would be separated in the afterlife, one in the Catholic heaven, the other he feared cast out. He had failed. Jane would die a heretic in the eyes of his church, but in her own, she would die a martyr for the true gospel. Feckenham was so moved by her spirit that he asked for and was granted her permission to accompany her to the scaffold, to be a comforting presence in her final moments. In her last days, with the theological debates concluded and her fate certain, Jane turned her attention to her final farewells. She prepared for death with the same methodical piety and scholarly dignity with which she had lived her life. She wrote a long, beautiful, and deeply moving letter to her younger sister, Catherine. It was not a letter of sorrow, but a final sermon, a passionate exhortation to live a life devoted to God. "Live still to die, that you by death may purchase eternal life," she wrote, her words reflecting a faith that saw earthly suffering as a brief and insignificant prelude to the glory of heaven. Desire with St. Paul to be dissolved and to be with Christ, with whom even in death there is life. She also wrote a short, poignant note in her prayer book, which she intended for her father, the Duke of Suffolk, now a fellow prisoner in the Tower. There was no trace of bitterness or recrimination for the man whose foolish ambition had ultimately condemned her. There was only a daughter's love and a Christian's forgiveness. "The Lord comfort your grace," the message read, "and that in his word, wherein all creatures only are to be comforted." Perhaps her most characteristic final act was a gift to the brother of the lieutenant of the Tower. She gave him her copy of the Greek New Testament, the book that had been the foundation of her intellectual and spiritual life. On a blank page inside, she wrote a final message in Greek, Latin, and English. The English version read, "I have sent you, good friend, a book, which although it be not outwardly trimmed with gold, yet inwardly it is more worth than precious stones. It is the book, dear friend, of the law of the Lord. It is his testament and last will, which he bequeathed unto us wretches, which shall lead you to the path of eternal joy. It was the perfect final testament for a girl whose true kingdom had always been the world of God's Word. The morning of Monday, February 12, 1554, dawned cold and bleak. A damp gray mist hung over the tower, muffling the sounds of the waking city. The executions had been scheduled. Guilford Dudley, as a common nobleman, was to suffer the full public horror of a traitor's death on the more infamous Tower Hill, outside the fortress walls, before the baying London crowd. Jane, as a concession to her royal blood, was granted the privilege of a private execution to be carried out within the relative seclusion of the Tower's precincts on Tower Green. From the window of her lodgings, Jane watched as her husband Guilford was led away by the guards. He had sent a desperate message to her, begging for one last meeting, one final farewell. Jane had gently but firmly refused. Such a meeting, she explained, would only increase their misery and pain, and they would meet soon enough in the afterlife. She watched him walk across the courtyard, a handsome, proud young man whom she had never loved, but for whom she now felt a deep pity, on his way to his death. A short time later, she heard the rumble of a heavy cart and the murmurs of the guards. She looked out again and saw the sight that would have broken a lesser spirit. Guilford's headless body thrown carelessly into the cart, his blood staining the straw, being brought back into the tower for burial in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. The sight reportedly moved her to exclaim, "O Guilford, Guilford! The antepast is not so bitter that thou hast tasted, and that I shall soon taste, as to be the end of our tragedy." The appetizer of death, she called it, was bitter, but the main course would soon be over. Then it was her turn. The lieutenant of the Tower, Sir John Bridges, came to her rooms to escort her. She walked from her prison to the scaffold, a short distance across the damp grass of the green. She was dressed simply in a plain black gown, the severe color a stark contrast to her pale skin and red hair. She carried her prayer book in her hands. With her were two of her distraught ladies-in-waiting, and by her side, true to his word, walked John Feckenham. Her voice was steady and clear as she recited the 51st Psalm in English, the Miserere mei, Deus. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according unto the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. She climbed the few wooden steps onto the straw-strewn platform. Waiting for her was the executioner, a hulking figure leaning on a great gleaming axe, his face hidden by a black mask. She turned to face the small, somber gathering of witnesses, counselors, Tower officials, and a few lucky onlookers. Her speech was short, dignified, and delivered without a tremor in her voice. There was no trace of self-pity, no railing against the injustice of her fate. Instead, in a final act of submission to the law of the land, she admitted her crime. "Good people, I am come hither to die," she began, her voice carrying across the silent green. "I do confess, when I did consent to the thing, I did it unlawfully and against the will of the Queen's Highness." But she immediately followed this admission of legal guilt with a powerful assertion of her fundamental innocence in intent, declaring, "While I accept my guilt in this act against the Queen's Majesty, I wash my hands in innocence of ever desiring or seeking it for myself." She concluded by asking the people to bear witness that she died a true Christian woman and to pray for her soul. "While I am alive," she knelt down. The executioner, as was the custom, stepped forward and asked for her forgiveness for what he was about to do. She gave it freely. She turned to her ladies and handed them her gloves and her handkerchief. She gave her prayer book to Sir John Bridges. Then her ladies helped her remove her headdress and outer gown. The executioner offered to help her with the blindfold. She refused, wanting to perform this final act herself. She took the cloth and began to tie it around her own eyes. And in that moment, for the first and only time, her extraordinary composure fractured. Blinded, disoriented, plunged into a sudden and total darkness, she reached out, fumbling in the empty air for the block. She couldn't find it. A note of pure, childlike panic entered her voice, the voice of a lost teenager, not a Protestant martyr. "What shall I do?" she cried out, her hands searching frantically in the straw. "Where is it?" It is perhaps the most heart-wrenching moment in the entire brutal history of the Tudors. A girl of immense intellect and profound faith, who had faced down the Queen's chaplain and accepted a death sentence with superhuman grace, was in her final seconds reduced to a frightened, sightless child, lost and utterly alone. One of the onlookers, perhaps Sir John Bridges himself, stepped forward and gently guided her trembling hands to the cold, unforgiving wood of the block. Jane laid her head down. She stretched forth her body and with her last breath uttered the final words of Jesus on the cross. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell. The 9-day queen was dead. She was 16 years old.